Well, this is going to be the second half of our training on tree health monitoring. We're going to go over kind of the data collection protocols in the field. What's the best practices in terms of how to measure your trees, how to assess their health, that sort of thing. So thanks everyone for coming out today. And I'm going to go ahead and dive right into it. So just to review, again, the reason we're going over these standards is, first of all, of course, we want to support you in collecting good data, right? So these are standards. It's based on research and a whole program that the U.S. Forest Service put together on how to properly collect data on urban trees. So we're following their lead. It's not something that I just made up. And in addition to, wanting you guys to have good data, we also want, across the whole network, we want to be able to compare, the different types of things that everybody's doing. And if we have everyone collecting data in the same way, that makes it a lot easier to do that. So we can actually see, people that did this type of program, their trees did really well, or they did this type of care, right? They installed a drip irrigation system, and that meant that the trees survived better than the people that didn't. That's the type of question that we want to answer, and then share that out with the network so that everybody can learn from it and improve their programs. Once again, if you are interested in the Forest Service methodology, which goes into a little bit more detail than we can in this video, you can check out that monitoring guide that Megan has posted in the chat. That's really useful. And that's kind of a field guide that just goes through the basics. They also have another resource that we will talk about in a moment. Okay, so let's dive right into it with mortality status. So in our TreePlotter setup, we just call this status, but in the monitoring guide, they call it mortality status. So I just want to make sure we understand that's the same thing. And we did kind of cover this somewhat in our basic training webinar, which hopefully most people have seen. But I just want to cover, kind of briefly go over how this applies to monitoring trees that have already been planted. This is kind of the basic options. If you go into TreePlotter and click on that status field, there's that drop-down menu, right? And we have all different statuses here. And the idea is that this should encompass, hopefully any situation that you're going to find out there in the field. So we have proposed tree, if you're just adding a tree because you're planting it. We have canceled in case, I know for myself, there are a lot of trees that I hoped to plant, but, maybe the property manager changed their mind, or, you discovered some, there's concrete underground or something. So that's why the canceled status exists. We have delivered to partner, which, as a reminder, those are for trees where you gave them to somebody to plant. You hope, you assume, they've planted them, but we don't really know for sure yet until we go back and visit them, right? So that's why the delivered to partner status exists for that temporary period where you don't know for sure if the tree was planted. And this is going to be very important when we try to assess, the survival of our trees. A tree that wasn't planted is going to require a much different solution than a tree that planted and then died, right? Then we have planted alive. So again, this is for any tree that's alive, that's been planted, that we've confirmed has been planted, either because you were there to plant it or because you went back and you saw it, or maybe a partner told you. As a reminder, the alive part of planted alive is going to be defined based on the trunk. So, you could have dead leaves, or any, you could have all kinds of things, but if the trunk is alive, we're going to define the tree as alive. Next, we have standing dead. Same thing. This is based on the trunk and branches, right? So a good test to do, especially on young trees, which you guys might be familiar with, is you scratch the bark. And a dead tree is usually going to be dry. It's going to be brown underneath the bark, versus a living tree is going to be moist and green and soft. Even if the leaves or even some of the branches are all dead, you can tell that it's alive if it still has that green moving tissue beneath the bark. Okay, and then we have stump. Again, this is pretty self-explanatory, but this is a tree that's been cut down at basically a foot or less is how we define it. And sometimes you'll see stumps with sprouts. That's okay. Even though the tree's roots might technically going to be alive, we're still going to classify it as a stump. And same thing with standing dead. Even if you have sprouts at the base, but the trunk itself is dead. We're going to classify that as dead just so that we have a place to draw the line. Planted, removed. This is the next status. This one is going to be used for situations where you know that the tree was planted and that it has subsequently been completely removed, including the stump. And the reason I mentioned that is we need to know that the tree was planted in order to distinguish between trees that were never planted and trees that were removed, right? So those can sometimes appear similar when you go back to the site because the tree's not there, right? That might be all you know. So if you're marking it as removed, that means you know for a fact it was planted. There's some evidence that it was planted, right? So it doesn't need to be, we're not convicting someone to death row or something. We just need some form of evidence. So if I see, in the place where I expected there to be a tree, there's like a bare patch in the grass and it's been a few years, that can be good enough evidence that there was a tree there, right? Next, we have never planted, and this is kind of the inverse of that. This is where you go to the site, you don't find the tree, and after investigation, you realize that actually the tree was never planted at all. Maybe you talk to a homeowner or something and say, oh yeah, it died in the pot before I got a chance to plant it. Or, sometimes it's because your records were mistaken, right? If there was a park planting project that you were hoping to put a tree somewhere, you brought the tree out to the park, and then it turned out, oh, we can't put it there because, like I said, there's concrete underground or something like that. Then maybe you forgot to mark that tree wasn't planted. So when you go back out into the field, you find that it's not there. You talk to the person that was at the planting, then you can mark that as never planted. And then next we have missing. This is a status that I actually added. It's not part of the Forest Service methodology. So if you go and read that, you will not see this one. And I added it because there's a lot of situations where even after investigation, you may not know whether the tree was planted or not, especially for programs that do stuff with homeowners. If the homeowner moves away or you can't get in touch with them, it can be tough to know what happened. But if you've conducted a search of the property and the tree's not there, you will put missing if you're unsure whether it was planted or not. Finally, we have this removed and replaced. This is a status that exists mainly so that you don't get confused, because when you remove a tree and then replace it with another one, you're going to create another tree in the same location. In TreePlotter, you can add it as a separate tree. You don't want to modify the old tree because that's going to overwrite that data on the dead tree, right? That would get confusing. So we're going to create a new separate tree, and you're going to mark the old tree as removed and replaced. So that way, when you're clicking around and you're doing your inspection or whatever, you don't want to accidentally do the inspection on the old dead tree, and there is a way to hide that tree from view if you want to avoid confusion. And then the very last one, which hopefully you won't need to use too often, is the unknown status. And this is just a catch-all to be something else, where you couldn't figure out what was going on. Typically, this might be because you have trouble getting access to the site. Ideally, we don't want to use this status any more than absolutely necessary. So try to fit it into one of the other categories if you can. If that doesn't work though, and you need to record it as unknown, make sure that you leave a note explaining why it's unknown, because by itself, the unknown status doesn't actually give us any information about what's going on. So if, for example, the tree's on private property, you couldn't get a hold of the property owner, it's got a high fence, you can't see it from the street, then you might mark it as unknown and put in the notes that you couldn't get access to the property to tell how the tree is doing. Okay, so this is a flow chart that I created that kind of shows what we're going to go through when we go to a tree and we want to assess what status it is. So the first question you want to ask yourself is, was the tree actually planted? So, obviously if you see it in the ground, it's pretty self-explanatory, or if you were there or somebody you trust was there and they told you that it was planted, then the answer is going to be yes, and then you're going to assess it as either alive, standing dead, stump, or removed. If you know for a fact that the tree was not planted, then you're going to put never planted. So this might happen in my experience with like homeowner programs. You go to the site and you see the tree is still in the pot. That's a classic situation. You can put never planted, because when we talk about planted, we're saying in the ground, right? Keeping the tree in the pot, it's never going to grow into a tree. We don't want to count that as, oh, everything's great, it's alive, it's healthy, right? The other situation that you might run into there is, again, if there's some kind of record keeping error, you can mark that as no planted. or never planted. And then finally, there may be those situations again where the answer to that question is maybe. And if we're not sure, that's why that missing status exists. But again, we want to only want to mark missing after we've kind of conducted a thorough search to make sure that the tree didn't end up, somewhere nearby. Maybe it's like across, the way in the park or something. We had to move it and we forgot to record that in TreePlotter. In that case, if you find the tree and you have, strong reason to believe that it's the same tree that you're looking for, then you would mark it as planted alive, and you might want to update the location for the future. But if you cannot find it, you can mark it as missing. Okay, so let's talk next about trunk diameter. That's what we call it in our system. Typically across the industry, it's called DBH, which stands for diameter at breast height. Sometimes people call it DSH, diameter at standard height, or DCH for chest height. So there's all different names for this, but we call it trunk diameter. But the U.S. Forest Service has created a really great video on how to measure trunk diameter. So we're just going to go ahead and watch that together because I think it covers it pretty well.
All right, now that you've set up your monitoring study, it's time to dive into the actual measurements. One of the most fundamental tree measurements is diameter at breast height, or DBH. It's a measurement of the tree's trunk that is typically recorded in a tree inventory or your monitoring projects.
I've taken DBH before. It's pretty straightforward. A measuring tape is wrapped around the trunk of the tree at 4.5 feet from the ground.
You're right, this measurement is generally pretty easy to record, but there are a lot of special circumstances that can arise and rules to follow in those special cases. So this video, we're going to review those rules. Recording DBH and recording it consistently and accurately over time is important for several reasons. Urban forest managers, as well as researchers, might be interested in how mortality rates vary across different size classes of trees. They might also want to know how much a tree is growing, with slow-growing trees being interpreted to have poorer overall health.
I'd definitely like to measure growth. How do I do that?
The simplest case for recording DBH is when it's possible to measure at 4.5 feet and the trunk is not leaning. Measure up from the trunk base, where the trunk meets the ground. Confirm the best measurement spot. If 4.5 feet works, then it's smooth sailing.
Do I really have to measure to 4.5 feet? Can't I just know where that is on my body and use that?
No, not really. Not if you want to measure growth accurately. It's important to remeasure at the exact same spot in the future to get trunk growth. Plus, measuring up the trunk really doesn't add much extra time. I recommend using a stiff household measuring tape to get the right spot on the trunk. Some field crews might also find it convenient to have a measuring stick or a PVC pipe with marking for 4.5 feet. So once you find 4.5 feet, hold that spot with your fingers or mark it temporarily with chalk. You want to make sure that the measurement is taken exactly at 4.5 feet. Then wrap the tape around the trunk.
So how are diameter tapes different than a regular measuring tape?
Oh right, the diameter tape, or D-tape as we like to call it, shows measurements divided by the value of pi. So it converts from circumference to diameter right there on the fly.
So that means if I don't have access to a diameter tape, I can just use a regular tape, right?
Absolutely, but then you have to remember to convert from the circumference to a diameter. Be careful about how you record that.
Okay, I'll remember that. You mentioned earlier that there are special considerations. What are those?
The D-tape should be wrapped snug, but not too tight. If a tree trunk is big, one person on the field crew should walk around the tree to make sure the tape has not gotten twisted or caught in the bark. You know, another really important thing to remember is to read the tape correctly, from right to left rather than from left to right. This measurement is 4.3 inches, not 5.7 inches.
One thing that I see often is that a tree will lean to one side. How do I measure the 4.5 feet distance?
You will still need to measure the diameter 4.5 feet from the ground. The key here is to measure the 4.5 feet distance along the underside face of the trunk. Then measure diameter perpendicular to the trunk. So one thing that makes measuring any tree difficult is when there are obstructions, irregularities, or things like vines on the trunk.
If possible, I usually rip the vines off since they shouldn't be there anyway.
That's one good way to do it. You definitely don't want to include them in the measurement. But if it's something you can't eliminate, like a bulge, a swelling, depression, or branches right at that 4.5-foot marker, measure immediately above that, right where it goes back to normal, and record that height of the measurement. For issues like branching flare, where going above the spot makes things worse, you can measure below the fork to avoid the swelling. As before, be sure to record the height at which you took the measurement.
That makes sense. But what if the swelling is actually below the 4.5 feet? I assume I'd measure a bit above all that swelling.
Yeah, you're right. One rule of thumb is to go about 1.5 feet above the end of the swell.
Okay, so to recap, I want to avoid any sort of irregularity by generally measuring above it if possible. But if that doesn't make sense, then below it.
Yep. So I think we've covered single stem trees pretty well. Do you ever encounter multi-stem trees?
I'm not sure. What exactly are multi-stem trees?
Those are basically trees that don't have a single trunk.
These trees seem like a pain to measure.
Yeah, they can be, but let's try to simplify things. There are 3 scenarios which differ based on where the tree forks. The first scenario is for when the tree forks at or below 1 foot. Record each stem as separate stems. Think of birches that fork around the ground level. So when you go to measure, start with the largest stem and record in a clockwise direction. If there are many stems, measure the 6 largest. And of course, record the height of where you measured separately for each stem. In the second scenario, if the tree forks between 1 foot and 4.5 feet, record as a single trunk below the fork. Record as close to 4.5 feet as is reasonable, given the swelling near the fork. The measurement height can be as low as 1 foot.
I feel like there are certain types of trees that are more prone to looking like this. In my experience, cherries tend to fork around eye level.
It does seem that way. Generally, the scenario covers cherries, crabapples, and hawthorns. Lastly, for scenario 3, if the tree forks at or above 4.5 feet, record as a single trunk at 4.5 feet. I know that was a ton of information, so let's try to recap. When recording DBH for every tree, the following should be recorded: the diameter measurement itself, the actual height used for taking that diameter measurement so that you can remeasure at this exact same point in the future to get growth readings, the units used, whether inches or centimeters. For more information on topics covered in this video, see Urban Tree Monitoring Field Guide and Resource Guide. Thanks for watching!
Okay, yeah. So the Forest Service has actually a short series of videos, which are all quite helpful. This was the one that I think was the most directly applicable to our program. But Megan can put the link to the whole series in the chat, and if you're interested, you can watch that. Just be aware that, like I mentioned earlier with status, there are a few situations where we've tweaked things slightly. And they also kind of go into a lot of other scenarios that I didn't think were as applicable for our programs, mainly because they're talking about, what to do in all these situations that have to do with like larger mature trees, which in general, I don't think is the main focus of our network. Although if you're interested in that type of program, it would definitely be useful to you. Okay, so yeah, check that series out if you're interested. A couple of things I want to highlight from that video. They talk about the measuring the height where you're going to measure the diameter. That's really essential. We want to require that for any trunk diameter measurement that you are taking. So please record that. However, in our system, we have it recorded as inches, not feet. So instead of 4.5 feet, it's going to be 54 inches. So just keep that in mind. You don't want to record that as 4.5 because then it'll be indicating that you measured it at 4.5 inches, which is going to be a lot different, right? The reason why we're doing it in inches is that a lot of our network are measuring very small trees, some of which might not even have reached 4.5 feet yet. So first of all, I wanted to mention that, there's a couple different ways to approach that. If you have a very short tree, you could just record the diameter as 0. That's totally fine. If it hasn't reached 4.5 feet yet, that's totally acceptable. Kind of depends on what question you're looking to answer. So again, this goes back to, thinking these questions through from the beginning of your survey. if you're not very interested in, if you're interested in kind of like long-term tree growth, you might just want to record that as 0 and then come back in a few years or, whatever, when that tree has grown. And then you can say, okay, now it's an inch, now it's 5 inches and so on and so forth. If you're specifically interested in how the tree is growing during the first few years of its life, you might want to alternatively just measure the tree at 12 inches of height. That's kind of our backup standard height, like they mentioned in the video. So that's what I've done in the past when I'm dealing with kind of smaller seedlings. You just get down in there and again, measure up to 12 inches, record that 12 inches. That's really important because if you're taking the DBH at 12 inches, you don't want to later accidentally think that it was much higher, because that's going to make it so those measurements are not comparable anymore. The other thing is, if your trunk is very narrow, you might have a hard time measuring it with a tape measure, which is the method that they discussed in the video, because at a certain point, the tape measure just can't wrap that tightly and still remain accurate. So there are a few alternative methods that you can use for very narrow trees. The one that I've used in the past is what are called calipers. So there's a tool called a caliper. You can search it up online, and basically it's kind of this shrinking and expanding thing that you put around the width of the tree, and then it reads out what the width is. The only thing you need to be aware of there is that, because the tree might not be perfectly round, you want to take two, well, that's why I named it, Dale, that's why I named it trunk diameter instead of DBH, right? That's the other reason. So with the calipers, you want to make sure that you take one measurement, along one axis, and then you're going to rotate your caliper 90 degrees so that you can measure it in the other axis. And then you want to average those two numbers to create a DBH, because if you did have a tree that was like highly longer along one side and narrower along the other, you wouldn't accurately be recording that if you only took one measurement. So just keep that in mind. The other option, if you don't want to use calipers, you can also take like a sewing thread or some kind of short string and just wrap it around the tree, make sure it's even, same way you would with D-tape, and then kind of pinch it where it meets, and then you can kind of unwrap that and measure that distance. That's going to give you, again, the circumference. So make sure that you are aware that you need to convert that circumference into the diameter by dividing by pi, as they mentioned in the video. So again, make sure that you're not making a mistake with these conversions, units, all this stuff you need to pay attention to as you're recording your data, because otherwise it's going to be way off. And last thing I want to mention on that is both the trunk diameter and the trunk diameter height are going to be recorded in inches. So they mentioned, that you can record which unit you use. That's not the case with our system. It's all going to be measured in inches. So I would recommend getting tools that measure in inches. And if you had to record in centimeters for some reason, you can also convert, using a calculator. Okay, next big one that you might want to record out in the field is crown vigor. So in our system, this can also be known as Vigor class, but in the Forest Service manual, they call it crown vigor. So I think I'm going to update the name to be congruent with what they have in there. But either way, it's the same thing. Basically, it is a quantitative measure of the health of the tree's canopy or crown, specifically like the foliage, the leaves, right? This is a similar measure to what some people might be familiar with in terms of recording tree condition. The biggest difference between a crown vigor and a tree condition is that the crown vigor is only looking at the health of the leaves, basically. Does not consider any structural deficiencies that the tree might have, or decay in the trunk, or bark injuries. We can still record that information elsewhere, but it's not going to factor into our crown vigor. The reason why we favor crown vigor over the traditional condition estimation is that a lot of scientific research has shown that tree condition is very subjective, and even very experienced arborists, they're going to rate the same tree very differently depending on the way they have their personal methodology. So the advantage of crown vigor is that we actually have a way to quantify it, and we're going to all be doing it the same way, so that way it's comparable across different people. One thing to keep in mind though with crown vigor is that you can only assess it when the tree is in full leaf. Okay, so for deciduous trees that drop their leaves during the winter or even in the fall, we really don't want to get into this because they'll be discolored and it'll be hard to tell whether that's just a normal seasonal change or whether it's due to some kind of stress. So make sure the tree's in full leaf. especially if you're in like a more subtropical area, like those of you in San Diego, this can get kind of complicated because in California, we have trees from all over the world, and some of them have different seasonal cycles. It's not just trees that lose their leaves during the winter. So especially some trees from, more subtropical areas, sometimes they have sort of a smaller leaf drop in the spring. So keep in mind the particular type of tree that you're measuring and make sure that you know what its leaf cycle looks like and that you're assessing its vigor at the correct time of year for that type of tree. If you go out there and you're measuring the tree and you know that for that type of tree, like if I was measuring a California buckeye right now, for example, I would just leave the crown vigor blank because I just can't assess it after the leaves have fallen off, right? And that's fine. We can always come back at another time to assess that. So how are we going to quantify crown vigor? Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to look at this tree over here on the side. Hopefully you guys can see that okay. And what we're trying to assess is what percent of a normal healthy canopy is missing, dead, or discolored, right? So we want to kind of imagine what this tree would look like if it was, completely healthy and normal, and then kind of count, what percent of that is missing in this case, right? Because the foliage that is there, it's green, it looks relatively healthy. So for this particular tree, it's really just that missing foliage. So a couple of notes on this are, this is going to be relative to what's normal for that species. So keep in mind that some species may have a more dense canopy while others might be more sparse. There are also trees that, have little flowering stems that grow, and then after they flower, they die back. That's normal. We don't want to dock the tree for, what's a normal part of its life cycle, right? So crepe myrtle will be a classic example of that. They have, a lot of people cut them off, but if you don't, they have those little dead stems that would not be counted as part of our healthy crown, right? Meaning that even if we have those little dead stems, if all the other leaves are in good condition, you would give it, 100% healthy or 0% unhealthy, right? The other thing is, if there are branches that have been pruned off, you want to ignore those. Don't worry about them. That's, part of the healthy tree, right? That we've done pruning on it. And also, again, if there's a seasonal leaf color change, you really don't want to dock the tree for that. So again, if it's starting to change color in the fall, I would just not assess the vigor at that point. However, if there are broken branches, we do want to kind of imagine, what part of the crown is missing due to that broken branch, because that's not, a normal healthy part of the tree that's happened. So let's go to the next slide here. And basically what I've done is I've kind of colored the areas of the tree that I think should have leaves in this case. And so that you can kind of visualize, what percent of the tree's canopy is missing in this case. So if you don't mind, I would love if everyone could kind of try to estimate, what percent of the tree's, kind of imaginary canopy is in the red versus the green in this case. So go ahead and think about that for a second and then type it into the chat. I just want to see what people come up with. One, don't be afraid. I'm not gonna kick you out if you get it wrong. So we got at least one person who's willing to go out there, and David, that's great. That's actually the exact same number that I came up with for this tree. So I had assessed that this was about 60%. And keep in mind that there is going to be some subjectivity here, right? Because we're not actually counting all the leaves and doing it mathematically. We're just kind of getting a general ballpark. And this is the reason why we are going to divide this into categories. So that's the next step of our evaluation. We're going to, now that we've come up with our estimate, right, which looks like everybody agreed was kind of between 40 and 65%. I think those are all, close enough. But now that we've come up with that estimate, we're going to put it into a category depending on what range it falls into. So there's 5 categories that we want to concern ourselves with. And they go from 1 to 5, getting, 1 being totally healthy and 5 being dead, right? So for 1, it's going to be a 1 if less than 10% of the canopy is unhealthy. 2 or slightly unhealthy is going to be 10 to 25%. 3 is moderately unhealthy, 26 to 50% missing. And then 4 is severely unhealthy, meaning more than half of the canopy is missing, discolored, or dead. But the tree itself, the trunk specifically, is still alive. And then 5 being the tree is kind of totally dead above about a foot of height is how we define that. So don't worry about if there's little sprouts at the base, same as with status. We want to assess it as dead if the main trunk and all the foliage are fully dead. So again, with our estimate here, like I said, I think most people kind of clustered around 60%-ish. That would put us into the 4 category, meaning this tree is severely unhealthy, but still alive, which I think makes sense, right? When we look at it. I think, if you had said this is 40 or 50%, that's okay too. There, like I said, there's a little bit of subjectivity. As long as you're within like one number of, if you're out in a pair, a good experiment, a good test can be, come up with your own assessment of this. And as long as you're within 1, that means you're doing okay. If you're 2 off, that might be an indication that one or both of you, still hasn't quite grasped this process. Because that's the standard we're aiming for. It's not going to, especially like if the tree is like right at 50%, right? It's going to be kind of subjective which one you put it into, and that's okay. Okay, so let's try again. Here's another tree, and same thing, kind of go through the same process here. Look at this tree, only this time I'm not going to give you the colors to help you. And think about, what percent of this canopy is dead in this case, or missing, and what vigor class would you put it into? So instead of doing the percentage this time, if you guys can type in the chat, which number you think it belongs to. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the definitions are there on the slide if you need them. Okay, so looks like we got some good answers there. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So in this one, I did color in the areas that I thought, should have foliage or are dead. And I had estimated this one about 35%, roughly a third of the canopy, I think, is affected here. And so I had put that one at a 3, which looks like it's kind of the consensus of the group. So that's great. And you guys were all within 1 of 3. So like I said, that's the standard that we're trying to meet, right? So great job. All right, let's do another one here. Okay, so we're getting a couple of responses here, so I'll go ahead and advance. And this is the same thing. So it could be a little hard to see in this photo. It'd be a little easier to see if you were there in person, I know. But there are a couple of smaller twigs that had died back here, but most of the canopy looks healthy. It does look a little bit drought stressed to my eyes, but we're not necessarily going to count that against it, especially because I took this picture when it was about 110 degrees out. So the tree was just trying to preserve water given the extreme conditions that it was in, even though it is getting watered. So I estimated these 2 little dead sections to be about 5% of the tree, and so I put it in the 1 category. I don't think you're totally off base if you had guessed this was 2, right? If you thought this was closer to 10%, and especially if you saw, okay, the foliage, it's healthy-ish, but it's not 100% healthy. 2 wouldn't be totally off base. That's okay too, I think. Okay, last one. I want you guys to assess this one, and I'll warn you in advance, this one is going to be a little bit tricky. Okay, so I think most people actually picked up on it, which I'm very impressed by, because I deliberately took this one to try to throw you off, but I guess people didn't fall for it. So this is a tree that kind of the upper canopy is really healthy. But if you look closely, there's actually a little bit more going on here than might be initially obvious. Because, first of all, we had this little, dead patch here. That's kind of strange, right? And that was kind of my hint to take a little bit of a closer look. So actually the lower canopy, even though we don't see it here, it's missing a lot of smaller branches. And so there's another photo I took from a different angle where you can really see this more clearly. And what happened here was a lot of the lower branches of the tree got snapped off. And the reason is this is a school, so there's a lot of kind of rambunctious kids running around. Unfortunately, we've seen the effects of that. So even though this tree is overall doing fairly well, it has had significant damage done to it. And so I tried to imagine, if we go back to that slide, I tried to imagine sort of what those branches based on their size should look like. And I sort of factor that into my mental calculation. So in this case, I ended up, like I said, at about 15%, and I put that in a 2. So this is just a good reminder that, don't just be too quick to assess this. You want to walk around the tree, look at it from all angles, look at it from close up, maybe even take a step back if it's a big tree, and kind of make sure you don't miss anything important. Okay. But yeah, great job for you guys picking up on that. I'm impressed. I thought everybody was going to say, oh yeah, this tree's totally healthy. And yeah, 2 is pretty common, but you don't want to just go to 2, right? You want to make sure to assess the tree based on the conditions that it has. Try not to be biased, right? That can be a tricky thing when we're doing these, somewhat subjective metrics. So especially when you're starting out, like I said, it can be handy to have 2 people out there so you can kind of see whether you agree. And if you don't, you can talk about, why you don't agree, right? If you're interested in more information on this topic, we had another webinar on a very similar method that Doug Wildman uses, which is posted on our YouTube channel as well. So if you want to see more examples of kind of the same basic process, check that out as well. And he goes into a little bit more depth with it. Okay, so moving on from crown vigor, I wanted to talk about additional measurements that you could take. So if you're really interested in tree growth, tree height and crown diameter are other metrics that I've seen recorded in the past. I think for most people, this is going to be not worth the time in the field, especially if you're a smaller organization. And the reason is that the trunk diameter is very highly correlated with these things. So unless you're specifically interested in them, I probably wouldn't recommend measuring them. But if you are interested specifically, there is a resource guide, which is different than the field guide we posted before. And that's also by the U.S. Forest Service. And it's a very, very long document, so you probably won't be able to read the whole thing. It's like 150 pages. But what you can do is search or look at the table of contents, find those things. It's just a long list of all the different things that you could measure. And then, read that section. It's going to tell you, well, why would you want to record this or why wouldn't you, and how to do it right if you want to. So just keep that in mind when you're designing your monitoring program. You want to think through, again, how much time do we have to devote to this? Keeping in mind that travel times, you do want to collect stuff that's useful out there, but you don't want to spend too much time where, it's going to take you 30 minutes to measure each tree. That wouldn't be very efficient. Okay, so then a couple of other things that I want to talk about that are a little bit more kind of categories, right? Not so much assessing the health of the tree, but like mulch, right, is a big factor that we know affects tree health. So I know in the ideal world, we mulch all of our trees that we plant, and then we come back regularly and we replenish the mulch, right? But in practice, this doesn't always happen. So this is an important thing to record information on as well. And again, because it's a visual assessment, it's fairly easy and quick to measure. So first of all, I want to define what mulch is. We're talking about coarse plant material. So typically we use wood chips. Sometimes people use bark or even leaves or other things. That's fine. We're still going to count that stuff as mulch, even though wood chips are the best. However, we don't want to count rocks. That's a kind of a common landscaping trend right now. Doesn't have the same effect on the tree. In fact, it's a lot worse for it. So we're going to count, like if a tree has rocks below it, we're going to count that as no mulch, not a different type of mulch. And then same thing with like plastic or other artificial materials. Those are not mulch either. So in TreePlotter, we have a few different categories that you can record. You can record that the tree is correctly mulched, which we will define as mulch that's at least 2 inches deep and that extends to the drip line of the tree. So for those who don't know, the drip line is basically the outer edge of the branches. So for a small tree, it's going to be fairly narrow, but as the tree grows, those roots are also going to be expanding. We want that to be covered by mulch as well. So that means it's at least 2 inches deep across the whole drip line area under the tree, basically. Maybe a slight exception for right up against the trunk, right? We don't want to bury the base of the trunk in mulch, so that's okay if that area is a little bit thinner. And this is very easy to measure with like a pole, or you can even just use your fingers, just kind of scrape away the mulch, get down to the soil level and see what the depth looks like. One thing I do want to emphasize here is that, when we're planting trees, we're usually aiming to apply a lot more than 2 inches of mulch. This is just the bare minimum here. So we're not, I don't want anyone to be confused that they should be putting 2 inches of mulch on their tree. That would not be enough. But the reason we do more is, first of all, that mulch is going to settle a little bit over time. It's also going to break down. So we're trying to add enough in the beginning so that it's going to protect the soil long enough that we can come back out there and repot, right? If there is mulch and it's less than 2 inches or it's too narrow, you can choose the insufficient mulch option. Or of course, if there's no mulch at all, just put no mulch. And once you've collected this data, you'll be able to see how does this actually affect the tree health, right? Because maybe you'll find out that that Vigor class that we just estimated is going to be lower on average for trees that don't have mulch. I would expect you would find that if you collect data on enough trees. So that'd be an interesting experiment to do. Next thing that we know really affects tree health is the planting depth. Hopefully people are familiar with this concept, but if it's new to you, the tree needs to be planted pretty close to the depth that it wants to be at. If it's too deep, especially, that's really harmful to it. So this is another thing that can be recorded, especially for a program where you have volunteers planting your trees or it's homeowners or something like that. This is really important to record because, if it's not the experts that are out there planting the trees, sometimes this doesn't get done right. You can record, we have the buried too deeply option in the dropdown, and that basically means the root flare of the tree is buried. The root flare, for those who don't know, is basically the very bottom of the trunk here. It widens out, and you can see that there's this little change in bark texture as well. So this is a tree that's been correctly planted, and since we can see that root flare there. In contrast, this upper tree, see how the trunk just goes straight into the soil? There's a little bit of a taper as the trunk goes down, but there's not an abrupt widening. And that's usually a sign that this tree was planted too deep, which is honestly pretty common. Like most trees that I see planted by landscapers are planted too deep. So make sure to assess that. Another way you can tell if you're not sure is, what I like to do is kind of brush away the mulch and even like brush away a little bit of the soil on the surface, and you'll see that trunk just kind of continuing straight down into the soil. And oftentimes, depending on the species, you won't even see any roots right below there, because the roots are very deep underground. And that's why this hurts the tree, because those deep roots don't get enough oxygen, and the trunk, when buried, it can cause decay issues and other problems. The other problem that you can, so for a correct depth tree, you want to see that root flare visible, but you also want to see that the major structural roots of the tree are covered by soil. So I don't see this as commonly, but it can happen, especially if you've really emphasized to people don't plant too deep. Sometimes they might overcorrect a little bit. And you might see kind of these bigger woody roots kind of spidering above the ground, right? We don't really want to see that either, although actually that's not, even though it looks really ugly, it's not as bad for the tree as planting too deep. So actually the tree that I took this picture of, if you zoomed out and saw the canopy, it actually looked totally fine. I'm sure it was stressing it a bit, but it was doing okay. In contrast, a lot of trees that are buried too deep, they'll kind of just sit there, they look sickly, they don't really grow. And if you're not kind of tuned into this, you might not be sure why the tree isn't growing. So again, we have those 3 categories that you can record, and you can see what the health outcomes are for those different categories. Okay, irrigation. So there's a lot of different information that we can collect about irrigation. There's actually several different fields in TreePlotter where you can record this information. So one of them is the irrigation method. And because trees may be irrigated by multiple methods, you can select multiple types of irrigation and record that on your tree. So for example, in this tree in the picture, we can see it's getting hand watered, and it's also in a green lawn. So there's probably sprinklers around somewhere, right? So we might record, hand watering and sprinklers for this tree. The other thing you can record is what's the frequency of irrigation that the tree is getting. And to make it clear what we're talking about, we define that as the typical summer schedule that the tree is getting, right? Because summer is the time when the tree is most needs the water. That's what we're most concerned about. So, for example, in Sacramento here, oftentimes we say to water the tree, a newly planted tree, about 3 times a week. That's going to vary a little bit depending on the climate, of course. So you can record, the frequency, number of days is how we're going to define that. So, you could be 3 days a week, could be 2 days a week, could be once a week, especially in a tree that's a little bit more established. You might water it less often, right? You do want to make sure that you're defining that as number of days though. So, especially if you have sloped or poorly draining soils, sometimes people will have multiple cycles of irrigation that happen in the same day. And that's basically just to split it up so that it has more time to soak into the soil. We're still going to count that as 1 day of irrigation, even if it runs 3 times on that day, right? Next, we have gallons per day of irrigation. So, is it getting 5 gallons of water? Is it 10, 15? Try to estimate that and you can put that. And these are all optional. If you don't have the information, you don't have to fill it out. Like method is probably the one that I would recommend doing in most cases if you have that information. But you don't have to do all of this if you don't want to. The last one though is kind of important. This is verification level. So ideally, you want to record the irrigation that is happening, that you've actually observed or that you've, done yourself potentially. But, there's also other types of information that you might want to collect, right? If a homeowner or a property manager told you, oh yeah, I water it by hose 3 times a week, you can put in verification that this is recorded irrigation, but you didn't actually observe it, right? Because in my experience, especially working with homeowners, they might be a little embarrassed about how often they actually got out to water their tree. And so they might remember that you told them to water it 3 times a tree. And they might report that they did that even if it didn't actually happen. So we do want to be able to distinguish between irrigation that we absolutely know happened and irrigation that we think hopefully maybe happened, right? The last thing you can record is kind of just a snapshot in time. What does the soil moisture look like at this exact moment? And this is going to be recorded as an observation field, which is kind of a different category of fields that I'm going to talk about in a moment here. So let's move on to the observations. So observations are basically, you saw that long, area of check boxes that Peter showed us earlier. And basically it's just a list of things that either apply or don't apply to the tree. So we're not putting any numbers or categories or anything like that. We're just saying yes or no. So if it's a yes, you check the box. If it's a no, you uncheck the box. So some examples, because there's so many of these, they're split into 3 categories, either observations about the tree, for example, trunk damage, like we see in this picture, that would be an example of a tree observation. And so again, that's where we can record any issues with the trunk, not incorporated into that Vigor class assessment that we did earlier. We also have biotic pests, and that's going to include fungus, bacteria, insects, anything that's attacking or otherwise affecting the health of the tree that is a living organism. So it could even be like a vertebrate, like if there's deer browsing on the tree, that could be something that could be reported as a pest, even though we don't always think of a deer as a pest, right? But for the tree, it is. And then finally, we have observations about the tree's environment. So this is where you could record that, there's a soil nutrient deficiency, or for example, if you probed into the soil with your fingers while you're out there and it's just rock hard, there's no evidence of any moisture, then you could record that the soil is very dry. Or conversely, if it's flooded underwater, that's another thing we can record here. So there's a lot of different stuff you can record, kind of depends on how much time you have to assess them. But in general, most of these things are just stuff you might observe as you walk around the tree. That's why we call them observations. But I do recommend checking on the soil moisture. That's one of the things that I always do when I'm trying to assess the health of a tree. You can usually tell, based on how the soil works, or even if you probe into it a little bit, if there's no moisture in the top few inches of soil, it might be a sign that it's getting under irrigated. And same thing, you can also make observations about, weed growth. Ideally, there's no weeds, right? But if there are weeds, and they're all kind of dead and brown, that's another clue that the tree is not getting enough water, right? And if you want to get really sophisticated, if you learn about the different types of weeds that grow in different environments, there's some type of weeds that will grow when the tree's being overwatered as well. So that might be something to think about. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is photographs. So this was also covered in the basic training but just to review, because this is a really important part of doing it, tree monitoring. The photograph that you take of the tree, if you take a good picture, it's probably going to contain more information about what's going on with the tree than all of this other stuff that we've talked about so far. And the great thing is, it only takes about 5-10 seconds to take a quick picture. So it's a really great and efficient way to collect information on the tree. So I highly recommend that you always do this. Always take a picture anytime you are there in person with the tree, right after planting and whenever you do an inspection as well. However, in order to do that, you need to know how to take a good picture of a tree, which is a little bit different than taking a good picture of a landscape or your body or whatever. So first of all, we want to make sure that the tree is well lit and it's distinct from its background. So in this case, I probably could have even done a slightly better job with this, right? Because I have the tree, part of the tree is backed up against the lawn. I can still kind of make it out, but if I had gotten a lower angle here, I might have been able to get it back more against this concrete surface, which would make it a little easier to see. And ideally, you usually want the sun to be behind you while you're taking the picture, so it's shining on past you onto the tree, and then the light's coming back to the camera. If you take a picture of the tree with the sun behind it, it's going to be really silhouetted and hard to see much detail. You want to be at the right distance from the tree, so that ideally the tree is filling most of the frame. You don't want to be too far away or too close to where you can't see the whole tree. If you're too far away, you're not going to have enough resolution to see what's going on the finer scale. And then ideally, if you can, if there's some kind of background object that you can see with the tree, that's really great to capture as well. In some cases, this isn't super necessary if it's the only tree around and you have a really accurate location recorded already. Maybe you don't need to worry about this, but particularly for bigger open sites, especially if you have multiple of the same tree in the same area, it can get a bit confusing when you come back later to try to figure out which tree is which, because if you record information on tree 1 year and then you accidentally record the information about tree 2 on tree 1 next year, your data is going to be all messed up. So you want to make sure that you're finding the same tree in TreePlotter and connecting it to the same tree in the real world as well. So the photograph can really help you do that, both in terms of the background, lining up. Okay, I see that lamppost is in front of that big redwood back there, and that way if those are both in line, I can tell it must be this tree and not this other one over here. But also you can look at the branch structure too. For example, on this tree, I can see it's got this kind of big side branch and there's no trees on the other, there's no branches on the other side. So it's going to look a little different if I came back a few years later, but I might still be able to see kind of that same basic structure, just a little bit more grown. Particularly when it comes to inspections, there might be a cause to take more than one photo of the tree. So if there's any potential problems like pests, that was something that Peter mentioned earlier, or if there's damage at the base of the trunk, like that picture I showed you before, those would be great things to capture visually as well, so that you get extra information on them. So don't be afraid to take multiple pictures if you need to, because again, it's very quick to do and it contains a lot of information. And then finally, I think most people are going to be assessing trees that they've already planted. You should know what species it is, but if there is any question of uncertainty in terms of the identification of the tree, taking some really good close-ups of like the leaves, flowers, seeds, anything like that, that can help you identify it once you get back to your desk, or that you can send to, somebody who can help you, like me, for example. If you take good pictures, like a lot of times I'll even look through the data in TreePlotter and I've noticed trees that people have misidentified. So if you take good pictures, that helps me help you as well. Okay, so those are kind of the basics of the stuff that I would recommend collecting in the field. There's a lot of other things you can collect, but again, check out that Forest Service resource guide for other ideas if you're interested. But once you've collected all this data, what are you going to do with it? First of all, you can just kind of assess what's the overall survival and growth across your whole operations. What does that look like, right? And again, thinking about, if you want to assess the overall survival of all your trees, that means you need to be collecting accurate and unbiased data on all of those trees, right? Not just like one little section and assuming that everything's the same. So keep that in mind, depending on what you're trying to answer, what trees you monitor might look slightly different. Again, you might want to do reporting for grants. I know some CAL FIRE grants in the past have required this of people, that they have to go out and check on how the trees are doing. So in that case, you might just be looking at the trees that are covered by that grant. But there's a lot of other things you can do as well. You might want to assess, what are the differences between two groups of trees that are, different in some significant way, right? If you have two different programs, right? Like if you have a program that's focused on parks and a program that's focused on schools, you might be interested, are the trees in one, under one that are being cared for by one government agency doing better than another? Or you could look at different species or different care techniques, right? Like if you decided, if you had a really committed group of volunteer waterers in one neighborhood and not another, you could look at, well, is it worth the effort? Are the trees actually doing better on that basis? Hopefully they are, they will, but it would be interesting if they weren't as well. And then finally, we kind of already covered this because people had questions about it, but there is a question of, do you want to look at your data inside of TreePlotter or outside of TreePlotter? So TreePlotter has some great visualization tools. You can filter down. There's different graphs you can create. So there's a lot of options in there. I would encourage you to check those out and take a look. And some of the videos that we've linked on our program page kind of go through a lot of those filtering and visualization tools if you're interested. But for some things, you might want to export the data as well, like particularly if you wanted to share it with someone or you wanted to do some kind of more advanced statistical analysis. And in that case, you would go into the data table like we showed earlier, click on the inspections button and export that out. So that option exists for you as well. And then just briefly, I want to mention that inventory program page that I've been talking about. Here's the link to it. Has a lot of our past webinars that we've done. It's got some videos produced by Planet Geo as well. So there's great things on there. And when we don't have any upcoming webinars right now, but we do have my office hours that I do maybe every other week typically. So if you have further questions, that's a great place to have a more one-on-one opportunity to go over, kind of dig in more depth to your particular issues. And then finally, for those of you that are not a part of the program yet, there is some eligibility information and the application if you do decide that you want to get involved in our specific program. And then finally, we also have support.treeplotter.com. This is a really great website with all kinds of FAQs and basically covers every possible topic that you would be interested in learning about TreePlotter. Not going to go into those tree measurements and things like that I just talked about. But if you do have a question about any kind of TreePlotter feature, like those work records that we talked about earlier, which we haven't really covered, definitely check out that webpage and do some reading. And there's also videos on it as well. So with that, I will open it up for some questions. And here's my contact information. If you do think of a question later on, you can also contact me there and I'd be happy to help you. So let's see, we had a few questions in the chat as we were going. So I'm just going to scroll back up. So regarding DBH, so many of our trees will still have the shelters on it. Yeah, so that can make it tricky to measure. If you have, honestly, like calipers might be the easiest way to do that, kind of reach down in there with the calipers, although that might not work. Or you could use that sewing thread method that I mentioned earlier as well. Or, if it's too much trouble, you may also decide, hey, we're not going to record DBH until the tree grows to 4.5 feet, and that's going to be above the shelter as well. So again, if you want to just record it as 0 while the tree is short, that's totally fine too. So I think hopefully that gives you some options there. And do we have LinkedIn in case there's additional questions? I do not have a LinkedIn, but I think does ReLeaf have a LinkedIn account? Maybe?
Yes, ReLeaf does have a LinkedIn account. You can use the messaging tool, but we don't monitor it 24/7. So I think the best way would be to email Alex if you have a question.
Email or phone call and let me know. And depending on how busy I am, sometimes it might take me a few days to get back to you. I know some people are waiting on a response from me right now, which I will probably do after this webinar. Typically, if I'm not busy, I'll get back to you quickly. And then, like I said, those office hours are great if you have a more in-depth question, because sometimes it's just hard to explain over email, right? Like if you're like, how do I do a monitoring program? You know, kind of a broad question like that. And you might want to really go back and forth and say, what are your goals? How much time do you have to devote to this? All that kind of stuff. So sign up for those office hours. It's going to be really helpful, I think. Any other questions from anyone? Feel free to raise your hand or unmute or whatever.
Alex, I know we briefly went over the inspections with Peter, and you mentioned taking multiple photographs for a particular tree. Is there anything we should know about how to access those tree photos later on? Would they all be in the inspection field, or would they live easily in the main section?
That's a great question. And actually, this, if you're familiar with TreePlotter from the past, this was a problem, but they actually fixed it recently. So the photos that you take as part of an inspection, they will appear in that inspection if you go into the individual record. They'll also appear along with the main photos of the tree. So actually, I could show you real quick if I can get out of this. If we, well, I guess there's no pictures in the inspection right now. I don't have the ability to take one, so maybe I won't be able to show you. But yeah, if you click on tree and then you go to photos, I guess there aren't any, so the button's not there. But then it'll have the photos that you've taken and uploaded on the tree details form, and then it'll also have the photos from the inspections. And then if there's also, you can also have photos as part of a work record, and those will all appear in the same place, but there'll be a little icon next to each one that shows you, you know, was this a tree photo? Was this an inspection photo? Was this a work record photo? So they should all be there and you can access them however you want to. Any other questions? Okay, well, think about it. If you have any more questions, feel free to throw them at me. But otherwise, I don't know if anyone here needs CEUs, the arborist credits that we talked about, but we can put the survey in the chat at this point. If you are interested, you just need to go ahead and fill that information out there, and then you'll get your CEUs. So yeah, unless there's any questions on that or anything else, I'll open it up one last time if there's anything else.
Yeah, and if anybody has any questions about use scenarios, Alex could go over that since he has TreePlotter up too, if you want to do that.
True, yeah. So if there's any TreePlotter stuff that we didn't get to earlier, feel free. Okay. Oh, David, did you have a question? So yeah, maybe.
No, I was going to say thank you. This has been incredibly helpful, just to see all the details about how to do this and the methodology that we would use in the field to capture the tree health information.
Yeah, this was, I'm glad we got to it when we did, because I know a lot of people have been curious about doing this. So I will be curious to see like how useful it was as a webinar. Part of me almost thinks that it should be like some kind of workshop or course or something so that we could actually go over each step in a little bit more kind of hands-on way. So we're brainstorming about that. So, you know, if you're interested, let us know if that sounds cool. Maybe we can work on that at some point. Okay, well, thank you to everyone who came. I really appreciate your interest. And like we said, we're always available if you need anything else. And otherwise, I think we'll